The most dangerous man in this city isn't the mob boss holding a gun. It's Minho, the quiet vendor holding your morning coffee. To the Mafia kings sitting behind bulletproof glass, Minho is just a ghost in a dirty apron, a piece of background grime they've ignored for years. They have no idea his humble coffee cart is actually a high-tech spy station, or that the man serving them is a former secret agent recording every word they speak. As Minho pours a perfect cup, he overhears a secret that changes everything. He isn't going to the police. He's going to use the secrets he's brewed to start a war and tear their empire apart from the inside out. The city was cold and the neon lights were blurry. Minho stood behind his stainless steel counter, the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine acting as his only companion in the 2 a.m. fog. To the world, he was a man who lived in the steam, a quiet, middle-aged vendor with a tired smile and a stained apron. But beneath the cart's floorboards, a silent processor was humming, capturing every vibration and every whisper within a 30-foot radius. The midnight order was never about the beans. It was about the blood. A black sedan, sleek as a shark, pulled to the curb. Two men stepped out. One was a soldier, thick-necked and smelling of cheap cologne. The other was Park, the Syndicate's most efficient executioner. Park didn't look like a killer. He looked like an accountant who had lost his soul. He tapped a rhythmic beat on the counter with a gold-plated lighter. 2 blacks. Bitter, Park said, his voice as dry as dead leaves. Minho nodded, eyes down, moving with the practiced slowness of a man who had nowhere else to be. As the water began to brew, the directional microphones hidden in the cart's umbrella picked up the shift in Park's tone. "The boss wants it done tonight," Park whispered, barely moving his lips. "The docks. Section 4. No witnesses, not even the family." The soldier grunted, shifting his weight. "Even the lieutenant's kid." Park's silence was the answer. It was a cleansing order, a total wipe of anyone who could testify. This wasn't just business. It was a massacre in the making. Minho's heart didn't race. His training wouldn't allow it. Instead, his mind became a tactical map. For years, he had been a ghost, a silent witness to the city's rot. He had told himself he was just a collector of data, a retired agent living a quiet life. But as he handed the steaming cups to the men who were about to kill a child, something in his iron exterior cracked. The steam felt hotter. The simple vendor mask began to peel away. As the sedan pulled away into the rainy dark, Minho didn't close up shop. He didn't call the police, because the police were the ones who had sold out the kid in the first place. Instead, he reached under the counter and flipped a switch that hadn't been touched in 3 years. The coffee cart's digital display flickered, the menu board dimming as a hidden interface began to scroll through encrypted files. The transition was complete. Minho was no longer an observer. He was the actor who was about to rewrite the ending of Park's midnight order. He pulled his hood low, the steam from the leftover coffee rising around him like a shroud as he prepared to step into the war he had been avoiding for a decade. Minho's apartment was a crumbling unit above a laundromat, the kind of place people went to be forgotten. But once the 3 heavy deadbolts clicked shut, the nobody disappeared. He pushed a fake panel in his closet, revealing a room that smelled of ozone and cold metal. This was his ledger, the hidden hub of a ghost. Long monitors flickered to life, bathing the room in a clinical blue light. The feed from the coffee cart began to download, translating the street noise into clean, actionable data. His simple cart was a masterpiece of engineering. The steam wand was a signal jammer. The grinders were actually high-frequency recorders. Every face that had ever bought a latte from him was cataloged, cross-referenced with police databases and underworld registries. Minho sat in the center of it all, his fingers flying across a glass keyboard. He wasn't just looking at names, he was looking at the connections, the invisible threads of greed and fear that held the Black Sun Syndicate together. He opened a file labeled Park. The executioner's entire life was laid bare. His secret gambling debts, his mistress in Incheon, the 3 times he had skimmed off the top of the drug shipments. This was the ledger, a collection of sins that Minho had spent years brewing. He realized that the Syndicate wasn't a fortress, it was a house of cards. They weren't powerful because they were smart, they were powerful because they were loud. Minho's eyes focused on the Section 4 docks. He could see the security cameras in the area. Already hacked, and looped by his own software. He watched the shadows moving on the screen, the Syndicate's men taking their positions. He had enough evidence to destroy them legally, but the law was a slow tool for a fast problem. He needed something more surgical. He began to draft an anonymous message, his face reflected in the screen like a mask of cold intent. The tech was beautiful, but it was just a tool. The real power was the information. Minho knew who the boss trusted and who the lieutenant hated. He knew that in the Mafia, the only thing more dangerous than a bullet was a lie that sounded like the truth. As he prepared his first move, he looked at his old service pistol sitting on the desk. He didn't pick it up. In the 2026 fast-cut world of the underworld, information didn't just kill, it erased. He closed the ledger, the blue light fading from his eyes, leaving him in a darkness that felt like home. The next morning, the air was thick with the smell of rain and expensive tobacco. Minho was back at the cart, his face a perfect mask of boredom. The lieutenant, a man named Han with a temper like a live wire, was his first customer. Han was the boss's right hand, but he was also a man who lived in the shadow of his own insecurity. Minho watched him through the steam, waiting for the perfect moment to plant the seed. "The usual, Mr. Han?" Minho asked, his voice low and steady. Han didn't answer. He was staring at his phone, his jaw tight. Minho leaned in, as if to wipe the counter. "Rough night at the docks? I saw Park heading that way late." He looked focused. It was a tiny remark, a pebble tossed into a still pond. Han's eyes snapped up, sharp and suspicious. Park was supposed to report directly to Han, but the cleansing order had come straight from the boss. Park was at the docks? Han hissed, his voice dropping an octave. Minho acted as if he had said too much, pulling back with a nervous flick of his rag. "Oh, maybe I was mistaken. You know how it is in the dark. Just thought he looked like he was on a special assignment. Very secret." He let the word secret hang in the air like a bad smell. He saw the vein in Han's forehead throb. Paranoia was the Syndicate's true language, and Minho spoke it fluently. To tighten the knot, Minho accidentally left a burner phone screen up on the counter. On it was a fake message from Park to an unknown number. "The lieutenant is the leak. The boss knows. Act accordingly." It was a bold move, a high-stakes gamble. Han saw it. His eyes went wide, his hand shaking as he grabbed his coffee. He didn't say a word, but the way he walked back to his car, fast, erratic, and looking over his shoulder, told Minho everything he needed to know. The seed was planted. In Han's mind, Park was now a rival and the boss was a judge. The trust that held the Syndicate together was beginning to fray at the edges. Minho went back to frothing milk, the sound of the steam covering his silent satisfaction. He wasn't just a vendor. He was a conductor, and the orchestra of the underworld was beginning to play a very dark tune. The first seed of doubt had been sown, and in this world, doubt always grew into violence. By the third day, the city felt different. The tension was a physical weight, a bitter aftertaste that lingered in every alleyway. Minho watched from his cart as the first internal hit happened. It wasn't a grand shootout. It was a quiet betrayal in a parking garage. One of Han's loyal soldiers was found with a bullet in his head, a message from someone who thought they were being betrayed. The virus of paranoia was spreading, and the Syndicate was starting to eat itself. Minho's monitors back at the hub showed the chaos. Encrypted calls were flying back and forth, full of accusations and panicked questions. The boss, a man named Kim who valued loyalty above all else, was retreating into his fortress. He didn't know who to trust. Every time a car slowed down near his estate, his guards reached for their weapons. The atmosphere was a powder keg, and Minho was the one holding the match. He decided to push harder. He sent a single, untraceable file to the boss's private server. It contained a recording of Han, the lieutenant, talking about taking over and ending the old man's era. It was a deep fake, a masterpiece of audio manipulation Minho had crafted using years of Han's coffee shop conversations. In the recording, Han sounded cold, calculated, and ready to kill. It was the final straw. The boss wouldn't wait for proof. In his world, suspicion was a conviction. Minho stood at his cart, serving a group of businessmen, but his mind was on the radio waves. He heard the order go out. Take out Han. The hit was messy. A drive-by in the heart of Gangnam that left 3 people dead and the Syndicate's reputation in tatters. The internal war had officially begun. The cleansing order from the docks had been forgotten, replaced by a desperate fight for survival within the family. As the sun set over the skyscrapers, Minho felt a cold sense of justice. He wasn't a hero, he knew that. He was a man who had used the devil's own tools to burn the devil's house down. But the war wasn't over. The boss was still alive, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Minho cleaned his counter with a slow, steady hand, the bitter smell of burnt espresso filling the air. He knew the next move would be the most dangerous. The boss would be looking for a leak, and the invisible vendor was the only one left standing in the center of the storm. The Black Sun Syndicate was an exposed nerve, raw and screaming. The boss, Kim, arrived at the coffee cart not in a McLaren, but in a heavy, armored SUV. He stepped out alone, his eyes sunken and red from lack of sleep. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man haunted by ghosts. He walked up to the counter and stared at Minho for a long, agonizing minute. The silence was louder than the city traffic. "You've been here a long time, old man," Kim said, his voice a low growl. Minho played the fool perfectly. He let his hand tremble slightly as he reached for a cup. He kept his eyes low, his voice cracking with just the right amount of fear. 5 years, sir. Always here. Just me and the beans." He didn't look at Kim's eyes, he looked at the boss's expensive shoes. Now covered in the same street grime he swept every morning. Kim leaned over the counter, the smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne wafting off him. "Everyone I trust is dead or a traitor," Kim whispered, slamming a heavy hand on the metal. "The phones are tapped. The meetings are leaked. It's like there's a ghost in the walls." He grabbed Minho by the collar of his dirty apron, pulling him close. "You see everyone. You hear everyone. Tell me, who is the leak?" The pressure was immense. One wrong word, one slip in his idiot vendor persona, and Minho would be executed on the spot. Minho didn't blink. He leaned into the fear. I just see people, sir. They talk about their wives, their debts. Mr. Han, he was always so loud. Maybe he spoke to the wrong people. He threw Han's ghost under the bus one last time. Kim's grip loosened. He looked at Minho shaking hands and dismissed him as a non-threat. To Kim, a man who couldn't even keep a coffee cup steady was no match for a Mafia king. It was the ultimate test, and Minho had won by being nothing. Kim turned away, his shoulders sagging. He walked back to his armored car, convinced the leak was gone with Han. Minho watched him go, the tremble in his hands disappearing the moment the car door shut. He reached under the counter and tapped a command on his hidden screen. The boss's car was now being tracked by a GPS bug Minho had planted in the extra sugar he'd handed over. The hunt was almost over. The fool had survived, and now, it was time for the ghost to finish the job. The tracker on Minho's screen blinked a steady, rhythmic red. Boss Kim had fled to his secondary safe house, a concrete fortress disguised as a textile warehouse. But the boss wasn't just hiding, he was lashing out. Minho saw the headlights in his rearview mirror before he heard the engines. For black SUVs were closing in on his humble coffee cart as he tried to relocate. They weren't there for a latte. They were there to erase the last witness. Minho pulled the cart into a narrow, dead-end alleyway. He didn't run. He stepped out, adjusted his dirty apron, and waited. The SUVs roared to a halt, blocking the exit. 8 men stepped out, their silent submachine guns glinting under the flickering streetlights. "The boss says you know too much, old man," the lead hitter sneered. They moved in a semicircle, confident and slow. They saw a victim. Minho saw a series of tactical opportunities. With a flick of a hidden switch on his belt, the coffee cart roared to life. This wasn't the sound of brewing beans. It was the sound of a weaponized machine. A massive wall of high-pressure steam erupted from the sides of the cart, instantly turning the alley into a white void. The hitters panicked, firing blindly into the mist. But Minho was already gone. He moved through the steam like a ghost, his thermal goggles highlighting the orange heat signatures of his enemies. He didn't use a gun. He used the environment he had prepared. He pulled a tripwire hidden behind a stack of crates, sending a heavy steel pipe swinging into the chest of the nearest shooter. As another man turned, Minho slammed a pressurized canister of espresso cleaner into the ground. It exploded in a cloud of stinging chemicals, blinding the squad. The alley echoed with screams and the metallic clack of empty magazines. Minho was a blur of motion, a shadow that struck and vanished before the steam could settle. In less than 3 minutes, the hit squad was a heap of groaning bodies and twisted metal. Minho stood over the lead hitter, who was clutching a broken collarbone. The old man's tired face was gone. In its place was the cold, sharp gaze of a professional who had hunted much bigger prey. He didn't finish them. He didn't have to. He took their encrypted radios and tossed a single sugar packet onto the leader's chest. "Tell the boss's coffee is getting cold," Minho whispered. He stepped back into his cart, flipped the cloak drive on his GPS, and vanished into the city's veins. The Black Sun Syndicate's boardroom was a temple of glass and gold, perched 60 stories above the city. Boss Kim sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his last 3 surviving captains. They were arguing about who to kill next, their voices tight with fear. The doors didn't burst open. They slid back quietly. Minho walked in. He wasn't carrying a tray of drinks. He wasn't wearing his apron. He was dressed in a charcoal gray tactical suit that fit him like a second skin. The captains reached for their holsters, but stopped when they saw what was in Minho's left hand. It was a small, black detonator with a glowing green light. "I wouldn't," Minho said. His voice was no longer the shaky tone of a street vendor. It was deep, calm, and carried the weight of a man who had already won. He tossed a thick, leather-bound file onto the mahogany table. It slid across the polished surface and stopped right in front of Boss Kim. "What is this?" Kim hissed, his hands trembling. He didn't look at the file. He looked at Minho's eyes and finally saw the monster he had been bullying for 5 years. Minho gestured toward the folder. "It's the ledger of your life. Every murder, every bribe, every cent you stole from the city. It's also the remote trigger for the liquid thermite I planted under this floor 3 years ago while I was fixing your espresso machine." The room went deathly silent. Minho walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "You thought I was invisible because I was beneath you. You thought the man serving your coffee was a nobody. But the person you ignore is the one who sees everything." He turned back to the men. "That file is already being uploaded to the international authorities. If my heart rate skips a beat, or if any of you move, this entire floor becomes a furnace." The captains looked at each other, their loyalty evaporating in the heat of certain death. Boss Kim opened the file. His face turned ashen. He saw photos of meetings he thought were private. He saw bank statements from accounts he thought were hidden. He realized that his entire empire hadn't been destroyed by a rival gang or a police raid. It had been dismantled by a man who knew exactly how much sugar he liked in his morning cup. Minho stepped toward the table, the detonator steady in his grip. "The game is over, Kim. You can stay here and wait for the police. Or you can try your luck with the trigger. Personally, I hope you try your luck." The sirens began to wail in the streets below, a rising chorus of blue and red lights. Minho knew the peace wouldn't last. Even with the detonator, a cornered animal like Kim would eventually snap. As the first police helicopters breached the skyline, Minho triggered a smoke pellet. The boardroom filled with thick, gray clouds. In the confusion, he didn't head for the elevator. He headed for the service shaft, the city's true veins that he had mapped out years ago. He slid down the cable with professional ease, his gloves smoking from the friction. He hit the basement level and burst into the parking garage. 2 Syndicate guards tried to block his path, but Minho didn't slow down. He used a collapsible baton to sweep their legs and moved past them before they hit the concrete. His extraction plan was a masterpiece of timing. Every turn he took was calculated to avoid the police perimeter while staying out of the Syndicate's sight lines. He reached the street level and stepped into a nondescript delivery van parked in the shadows. Inside, the screens were still humming. He checked the upload progress, 99%. The sins of the Black Sun Syndicate were now public property. He pulled out a small tablet and watched the live feed from the boardroom. He saw Boss Kim being led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face hidden behind his hands. The Iron King looked like a broken old man. Minho drove the van through the back alleys of Gangnam, moving with the flow of the city. He changed his license plates at a prearranged stop and ditched his tactical gear in an industrial incinerator. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the secret agent was gone. He was just another driver in the early morning rush, invisible and ignored. His heart rate finally began to slow. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, hollow fatigue. He pulled over near a quiet park. He looked at his hands. They were steady, but they were tired. He had spent his life in the shadows, fighting wars that nobody would ever read about in history books. He had saved the city, but the city would never know his name. He reached into the glove box and pulled out his old, stained apron. He folded it carefully. The mission was over, but the world didn't stop turning just because a monster was in a cage. He had one more stop to make before he could truly vanish. The collapse of the Black Sun Syndicate was the biggest news story in a decade. The morning papers were filled with headlines about the ghost ledger and the downfall of Boss Kim. The streets felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally moved on. In the neighborhood where the syndicate once ruled with fear, people were coming out of their shops, talking and smiling. The new order wasn't about a new boss, it was about the absence of one. Minho returned to his corner. His coffee cart was back in its usual spot, looking exactly as it always had. The weaponized parts were hidden again, and the high-tech processors were offline. He stood behind the counter, the rhythmic hiss of the steam wand creating a sense of normalcy. He watched the people walk by. They didn't see a hero. They didn't see a spy. They saw the quiet man who sold the best coffee in Seoul. A young woman stopped at the cart. She looked tired, her eyes red from a long night of studying. Minho recognized her. She lived in the building where the cleansing order was supposed to happen. She didn't know how close she had come to vanishing. "One latte, please." "Extra sugar," she said with a small smile. Minho nodded, his hands moving with practiced grace. He felt a quiet warmth in his chest as he handed her the cup. This was why he did it. The city was quiet now. The power vacuum left by the syndicate would eventually be filled by someone else. That was the nature of the world. But for today, there was peace. Minho knew he would have to keep watching. He would keep his ears open and his sensors ready. He was no longer a ghost seeking revenge. He was a guardian in a dirty apron. He had found a new purpose in the simple act of serving. As the morning rush began, the familiar faces returned. They complained about the weather and the traffic. They treated Minho like background grime, and he loved every second of it. He was invisible again, and in that invisibility, he found his true power. He had traded a life of war for a life of service, but he knew that if the shadows ever returned, the ghost in the steam would be waiting. He wiped the counter one last time, the stainless steel gleaming under the morning sun.